Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Well, thanks for joining us again this week at Cold Case Christianity. We're back here finishing our last segment on the problem of evil. And if you've had a chance to join us in the past, you know we've been talking about all the attributes, all the characteristics or considerations you have to keep in mind when asking yourself, why would God allow any particular act of evil to occur in the universe if God is all loving and all powerful? Wouldn't he try to stop evil? And so we've been talking about that in steps, because I think the case we have to make is built cumulatively. So if you haven't had a chance to see how we've been building the case so far on 7 considerations, then I want you to go back, if you wouldn't mind, and look at our archive. Now, the archive can be viewed, for at least most quickly, at the Cold Case Christianity website. Just go back to our website, and you'll see there are a broadcast page there, and we have an archive there. It's also on our YouTube page. There's a link at the YouTube for the YouTube page on the website as well. The point is, you'll have a chance then to take a look at some of the prior episodes to see how we're constructing this case, because we're going to jump in today and finish it by talking about 2 more essential considerations you have to keep in mind. One, of course, is our limited knowledge. We're going to talk about how that plays into considering any act of evil. And finally, we're going to talk and summarize the case and talk about the need for a standard to really call anything evil to begin with. So we'll be doing that today. And we're taking a step through the 7 pieces, 7 steps for the cumulative case. In a book that we call God's Crime Scene, I really make several cumulative cases for all kinds of evidence in the universe, because in that book we ask the question, can we examine the universe the same way we would examine any crime scene? And ask the simple question we ask, for example, as homicide investigators at every death scene, which is, can I explain everything in the scene, in the room, by staying in the room? If I can, it's going to be some form of death that's not a murder. If I have to go outside the room for an explanation, then I've got an external suspect. That's different. Then I have to think about, well, who is the most appropriate intruder that may have committed the crime? So we took the same approach, if you've been watching our past episodes, with the entire physical universe, natural universe, and asked, looking at what's in the universe, can I explain everything I see in this room by staying in the room? And I think there are 8 important pieces of evidence. We're in a universe that has a beginning, that shows attributes of fine-tuning. That same universe, life originates from non-life, and the life that does originate bears the earmarks of design. Also, we are free, conscious beings that act with free agency in the universe, and we make decisions about what is morally true based on objective, transcendent moral obligations we all recognize and acknowledge. And finally, this issue we're talking about in the last 3 episodes and today, we have to explain evil, because all of us recognize that these 8 attributes exist in the universe. The only question is, how do we explain them? And remember that all of us, regardless of worldview, have an equal burden. You sometimes hear this said that, oh gosh, it's just Christians or theists who have a burden because they're offering that there's an invisible God that they want to posit as an explanation, and therefore the burden is on you to explain why we should believe in this thing we don't see. Well, really, what we're talking about here is trying to explain the stuff that we do see. The stuff that's in the universe, that's in the room, that has to be explained by some causal agent or some causal factor. So the force is either impersonal or personal, and it's either inside the room, it can be explained by some laws of physics and chemistry acting on space, time, and matter in the natural realm, or the cause is something that's outside of space, time, and matter. And the question then would be, well, what would explain that? If we think that explanation, that supernatural, extranatural, supranatural explanation outside the room is a better explanation, well, then we got to ask ourselves, but why would that explanation, why would that kind of a God, an all-loving, all-powerful God, allow evil to exist in the universe? And that's what we've been talking about. Now, you can make a list, we often do this in crime scenes, of evidence and explanations. And if you did that, Evil would be one of the 8 evidences in the universe we'd have to explain. And we only have a couple of ways of explaining them. One, we could stay inside the natural realm to explain these, or we can jump outside the natural realm to explain these. Which explanation best explains the evidence? That's what we do in every crime scene. That's what we do in every death scene. And so that's what we're going to do here when we look at the universe itself. So we've taken a look at this, and we've kind of penciled out an approach we might take where we look at the universe as a system and ask what's the best explanation for these 8 evidences? Let me put them in a chart for you. Here's a diagram of all 8 evidences. And I think that the first 7, I argue this in the book, are best explained by a causal agent, a personal causal agent outside of space, time, and matter. Now, I think those first 7 all point to that reasonable conclusion, and those are called inculpating evidences. Anytime you have evidence that points to a particular suspect, that we would call that inculpating. But you might be wrong, even if these are all strong, if you've got one overwhelming piece of exculpating evidence, something that is an alibi for your suspect. I don't care how guilty he looks, he couldn't have done it because he wasn't even in the country. Well, if that's the case, we have one piece here we haven't explained yet. One piece that's not pointing necessarily is this piece. Evil. Is that actually better explained as a piece of exculpating evidence? In other words, does it exclude the possibility of an all-loving, all-powerful God? That's what we have to ask ourselves when examining the problem of evil. And that's how it's typically offered, as that one piece of evidence that excludes the possibility that there's an all-loving, all-powerful God. Well, we're going to come back after the break, and we will talk about just this issue. Can we explain? We're going to offer the one last piece, one last consideration, and then finally summarize our case as we explain how it is an all-loving, all-powerful God would allow evil to exist in the universe.
Have you ever questioned the resurrection or know someone who has? Follow along with J. Warner Wallace as he examines the most important case in all of history. You'll learn how to think like a cold case detective and share the compelling evidence that Jesus truly is alive. We need to share the good news with those who desperately need to hear it. Will you become a case-maker for Christ? Order Alive in packages of 10 and begin sharing the most important message of all, the truth of the resurrection. Need a speaker for your next conference, retreat, training seminar, or church service? Jim travels around the country, making the case for the existence of God, the deity of Jesus, and the reliability of the Bible. He'd love to partner with you to create a powerful, transformational training experience. Just visit the Cold Case Christianity website and click the Book Me tab. You'll find everything you need to know there, including a list of Jim's speaking topics, promotional materials, Jim's speaking calendar, and a link to connect with our team so we can book your event.
Okay, so far we've talked about 6 considerations you have to keep in mind when asking why God would allow any act of evil. We talked about the role that eternity plays and how a proper understanding of eternity. Life is really not just a line segment from birth to death. If we are eternal creatures, then we have to keep in mind that anything God might allow at any point in that timeline with some larger goal in mind, it really doesn't have to happen in this lifetime, of temporal lifetime on earth. It could be something that is really meant to be culminated and fulfilled in eternity. We also talked about the role that free agency has. You cannot have freedom in which love is possible, genuine love, unless you have the freedom to hate. And that means you have to create a crazy dangerous universe if we hope for love to emerge in that universe. Then last week we talked about the appropriate definition of love. We sometimes think of love as a kind of a cultural way, as a sappy sentimentalism, when in fact, if you're a parent, you already know that the role of love often involves tough love you have to express towards your kids. And I think if there's a heavenly Father, he may be doing the same thing with us. Doesn't mean he doesn't love us. It means he has something beautiful in mind long term, and that it might suffer some temporary evil in order to experience that beauty. Also, we talked about the role it has in character development. Evil sometimes is the way to achieve the values and characteristics that all of us really value. We think of these as being very, very important. Characteristics of courage require the existence of danger. It's a response to danger where we find courage. If you want empathy, it means you have to have some suffering. If you want compassion to emerge, if you want forgiveness to emerge, you're going to have some evil that occurs that you have to forgive. Other people are going to do things to you that require your forgiveness. If you want charity to emerge, you're going to have to allow for poverty. In other words, the things that we value most and say are the most important to us as moral values, turn out all of those end up being expressions, responses to some form of evil. But you have to allow the form of evil if you want to get that response. And we also talked last week about the power of evil to draw us to God when we haven't been paying attention otherwise. And finally, we talked about evil as a consequence just of our own sin. In other words, there are times when it's just a matter of punishment for something we justly deserve to be punished for. Now, I'm not saying that's going to explain every act of evil, but it's those 6 things when properly proportioned and seeing the relationship between each one of those that actually ends up explaining evil that we experience. And today we're going to talk about the last piece of this puzzle, this 7-piece puzzle, and that is the role of our limited understanding. We're going to take a look at the ancient argument against God's existence that's offered by Epicurus. We started this entire series with this, where we talked about how Epicurus says this as the ancient Greek philosopher. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Well, then he's not omnipotent. How could he be if he can't stop it? Is he able but not willing? Well, then he's not malevolent. How could you call him loving then he's malevolent? In other words, he's not loving if he's allowing evil to occur when he could stop it. So it's either a matter of him not being loving enough or not being powerful enough. Then Epicurus says, is he both able and willing? Well, then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? So here's the dilemma. And Epicurus seems to be saying, let's just take it in a couple of lines, one line at a time. First, he says, hey, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Well, this is really a challenge to God's all-powerful nature. Maybe God's just not all-powerful then. And the second challenge he offers is he able but not willing? Well, he says he's malevolent then. In other words, this is a challenge to God's all-loving nature. Now, I think you'll see something here if you look at this carefully. This is an argument against this kind of God that is offered by theists and Christians, for example. But this isn't the nature of our God. This is just only a fraction of the nature of our God. As a matter of fact, this argument against God's existence makes sense if God is only all-powerful and all-loving. But if you add a third characteristic of God, the complaint really vanishes. Which is why I think the third characteristic of God is missing to begin with. It's because if we put it back in, really the argument goes away. And here's that third attribute of God. God's not just all-powerful and all-loving, he's all-knowing. All right, let's go back to our timeline. You remember we started with the timeline at the beginning of these talks in which we kind of charted out your life. You aren't just temporal creatures, you have an earthly life and you have an eternal life. And this is, if God is all-knowing, he has knowledge that spans both of these aspects, both of these periods of our life. You know that there's stuff that we know about, right? It falls in this category. It's the stuff that we know about based on our physical, material limitations in our temporal environment in the universe, given the short brevity of our lives. We are limited in our knowledge based on our nature and where we are and who we are and how we can access information to begin with. We have limits. But if there's a holy God, he's not limited like this. He actually has knowledge that spans the entire length of this timeline. Would that change things? Would it change things if you knew in advance what any particular act of evil, for example, might achieve? Would you take your hands off? Would you make decisions based on your long-term knowledge, your ultimate knowledge of what will come out of the situation? I think that might. As a matter of fact, there's a Franciscan Dominican priest named Jacques Monsabre, I'm sure I'm not saying it correctly, who said this: if God would concede me his omnipotence for 24 hours, you would see how many changes I would make in the world. But if he gave me his wisdom too, I would leave things as they are. That's a very powerful statement if you really think about it. And it expresses for me in a nutshell what I think the all-knowing nature of God does to remedy the complaint that Epicurus offers. Because we might think we would do things differently because we don't really have the knowledge that God has to begin with. If we had God's knowledge, we might understand why things are happening the way they are. And we know that if I take that little, event out of the timeline, something terrible happens down here. So I'm not even going to touch what seems to be a mess today, what seems to be evil in the moment. I'm not going to touch that because now I understand how it fits in the grander scheme of things. And that, I think, solves a lot of problems. Now, Alvin Plantinga says it this way, and he's not really talking exactly about this nature of it, but I think he at least addresses this claim that somehow, because you can't figure out how evil might be used for good, does not mean that there is no God. And he says it in a much more distinguished philosophical way when he says, say that an evil is inscrutable if it is such that we can't think of any reason God, if there is such a person, could have for permitting it. Clearly, the crucial problem for this probabilistic argument from evil is just that nothing much follows from the fact that some evils are inscrutable. If theism is true, well, we would expect that there would be inscrutable evil. Indeed, a little reflection shows there's no reason to think we could so much as grasp God's plans here, even if he proposed to divulge them to us. But then the fact that there is inscrutable evil does not make it improbable that God exists. Exactly. The fact that you don't know and I don't know why something might happen does not mean that there isn't a God who does. We'll take a break. We'll come after. We'll kind of wrap up this series on the problem of evil by asking, what is the standard we're measuring against anyway? I did 26 years working casework, and the better half of that in the end was working cold cases. And those cases got on national media. I think I've been on Dateline more than any other detective in the country. And the people who are involved in the process, if it's not that show or other media shows, are not always believers, but they get a sense of, well, this guy can puzzle a case together. Not that I am the only one who can do that, but you develop that skill set. If you're working in this industry, trust me, if you're out there watching this video, you know, if you're a cop, how to put a case together. So once you've demonstrated that, I think, for people, they may not agree with your conclusion, but remember, the evidence doesn't say anything. And science doesn't say anything. It's scientists and evidence evaluators that say something. So we're all looking at the same data points. We're all looking at the same evidence. I've got to draw an inference from the evidence, and I land it this way. Now, you may not agree with my inferences, but I think you can at least respect the fact that I've done the homework of presenting the evidence so an audience can assess it for themselves. So that's why I think I have supporters who don't agree with my inferences, but they respect the process. And that's one of the things I try to do uniquely in God's Crime Scene. I'm trying to give the readers not just here are the facts, but here are how detectives assemble facts to develop a case. Here are the processes, the rules that we obey, how we put a cumulative case together. How do we make cases? That's what I want you to come away with also, not just here are the facts, because you can get that out of any book. I want this to be unique in the sense that this is a book that not only gives you the data, but it instructs you on how to build a case, how to put the data together.
Be sure to visit the Cold Case Christianity website daily to read Jim's blog, watch the weekly video, or listen to the Cold Case Christianity podcast. You'll also find great free resources, including the free downloadable monthly Bible insert. While you're there, be sure to sign up for Jim's daily case note email. Cold Case Christianity is designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker.
Okay, we're almost done with our series on the problem of evil, making this cumulative case. And remember, we talked about all the 7 characteristics, the 7 attributes, the 7 considerations you have to keep in mind. And we've already gone through all that, but I'll show you the diagram one last time. So here's our diagram, right? And what we're really trying to do is figure out why God would allow any evil in the universe or any particular act of evil. And that's really what I think it comes down to. We assess evil in terms of its singular events that occur in our lives that we interpret as evil. So here what we're doing is asking, why would God allow any particular act of evil? And then that kind of helps us to answer the question, why does God allow evil in general? But when you're asking this question, the same way I work a case, I might say, well, gosh, there's these 5 or 8 or 10 things have to be just so in order for this case to occur the way it did. But then I got to figure out, well, what's the relationship between the 5 or 8 or 10 things? And what is the proportion, the weight that I would give each one of these things? Wow. That's really hard to do sometimes because you're trying to get inside the mind of a killer and figure out, well, how did he evaluate this and what priority did he give this thing over this thing? And that's really hard to do. Something even more difficult has to be done, I think, when assessing the problem of evil from the perspective of God. Remember, these aren't always in any particular act going to be an exact similar proportion as you see in this diagram. Sometimes one consideration is larger than another. And trying to figure out what it is that God's trying to do, what his values are, what the weights of each consideration is in any particular act at any particular time would be really tough, right? It's about limited knowledge again. It's about how do I get into the mind of God to even think I can understand why he would allow this. That's tough. And so I think you have to be realistic about that. And it's not just this. It's that once you've kind of try to figure out what proportion they play, well, how do I even understand what the connectivity is between certain things that are in the mind of God that would allow this? That's even more difficult. But I have to do all of that, it seems to me, to have a proper understanding of why God would allow any particular act of evil. Do you see the problem? The problem is pretty clear. Is that yes, we have these elements in play, we have these considerations in play, but trying to understand their connectivity and their proportions, that is the difficult part. But it's even more difficult than that, because unless we have some standard, we really have to ask ourselves, why are we calling this evil, whatever this thing is, whatever this act is, whatever this particular troubling experience is, why are we calling it evil to begin with? And that's the thing we have to ask ourselves. What is the standard by which we are measuring this? C.S. Lewis kind of understood this early as an atheist because he had a complaint against the existence of God, and he used to offer it all the time. Here it is in his own words. C.S. Lewis would say this: my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. In other words, he's using the problem of evil as exculpating evidence. Can't be a loving, all-powerful God if there is a universe that's this evil. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Do you see what he's discovered? He's discovered that unless you're willing to say that evil is simply a matter of opinion, well, if it's a matter of opinion, you could eliminate all evil tomorrow by simply changing your mind, changing your opinion of whatever it is you thought was evil. But we know we can't eliminate evil that way, because evil is more than a matter of personal perspective, personal opinion. We all believe there's true evil. Evil, some things that are so evil that your opinion doesn't change it. Of course, the problem is how can we call something truly, objectively, transcendently evil if, in fact, there is no standard of true, objective, transcendent good that we are measuring this act against? In other words, we've got to have a straight line to know that what the crooked line. When we see a crooked line, we only know it's crooked because we understand what the straight line was. And so if there is no transcendent straight line, then stop calling this thing you call evil. Don't act like it's truly evil. Don't act like it's objectively evil. It's just evil to you. It's a matter of opinion. You don't like it. That's all you can really say. I don't like it. Well, that doesn't seem to capture our response to what we think is true evil in the universe. We have a sense that it's more than just we don't like it. We think it's truly needs to stop. It's truly evil. But that, of course, pushes us in a different direction, doesn't it? That requires us to have a standard by which we can measure something. So see, if you look at our initial analogy that we started off with, this environment we're trying to explain all the evidence in this room, and we're trying to explain it, and right now we're offering that the explanation is God. Really? Well, then I think our objectors might say, well, no, evil, natural evil, whatever they want to call it, moral evil, all these things they're going to say are evidence that really exclude the reasonability of God. God, it might be possible, but he's no longer reasonable. He's excluded as a candidate because of evil. But here's the problem. If we're going to say that God's existence can be, we have to say that, well, it must not be reconcilable then with evil. If, on the other hand, we see this matrix of 7 things that may easily help us to understand how God's existence could be reconciled with evil, well, then we've overcome that challenge. And now, evil does not eliminate God's existence. In fact, it seems that you can't really have true, objective, transcendent evil if there isn't a true, objective, transcendent standard of God that you're defining. You're using this to define what evil is. It's the opposite of this objective standard of good. In other words, you can't even have evil if you don't have God as its definition, as its standard by which you measure something and call it good. And in comparison to that, the alternative is evil. In other words, it's not a piece of exculpating evidence. It turns out evil in the universe, true evil, is another piece of inculpating evidence that points to the reasonable existence of God, because you need God for that standard. Without God as that standard, true evil doesn't exist. Without God as that standard, all you have is something you don't like. And this is what C.S. Lewis said about that. He said, of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own opinion. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, truly unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies, his opinions. So once again, he's offering the same thing we've been talking about. If you're going to say that there's truly evil in the universe, you have to have a standard for good by which you are measuring evil, and that standard for good has to be outside the room. Do you see how, once again, we've got something inside the room that is best explained by something outside the room. And if you do this over and over again, if it's the beginning of the universe, or the fine-tuning of the universe, or the origin of life in the universe, or the appearance of design in the universe, or consciousness in the universe, or free agency, or objective moral truths, or evil, true, really true objective evil, if all of these things in very different disciplines, different sciences, different ways of thinking, if all of them just happen to point to the same reasonable causal force, a personal force, that really is the source of all personal moral obligation, well then, you've got good reason to believe that such a force exists. All the evidence in the room seems to point to something outside the room, and it seems to point to the same something outside the room. And that's why the case for God's existence is so powerful. Even evil adds to the case. So, we've talked about this on our website. You can actually go there and you'll see there are sections in which you can review the case for God's existence in different categories. You can look at just evil. We have a whole collection of articles that are downloadable. There are also PDF files that you can actually print. You can save them to use them with friends. You can print them out and put them in your Bible. They're designed to help you make the case. You can scroll down. You'll also see we have Bible inserts, so you can download the Bible inserts that'll help you to make this case to people who maybe have some doubts. And of course, the larger, more robust case, everything we've talked about in the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks now, has been built upon the information that I wrote about in a chapter on evil in God's crime scene. So I hope that that's a resource that you'll find helpful to you. Okay, so now we've covered really 8 things, 7 considerations, and 1 final closing argument on the true nature and standard required for evil. And I hope that helps you to make the case to your friends when discussing evil in the future. It won't be a short conversation, that I can tell you for sure. All right, I'll see you right here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.